Hey everybody, this video is called What Are the Priests and Levites Responsible For? And tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the 18th chapter of Numbers, where we're going to look at the responsibilities and the laws pertaining, relating to the priests and the Levites. And this is the midpoint, halfway through after this chapter through the book of Numbers. And starting with verse 1 in chapter 18, it says, "Then the Lord said to Aaron, you and your sons and your father's house with you shall bear the iniquity related to the sanctuary, and you and your sons with you shall bear the iniquity associated with your priesthood." So from this through the next 25 verses, God is going to directly speak to Aaron alone. And Aaron and his sons from this point on are being held responsible for any offense against the holiness of the tabernacle or any violation of the rules of the priesthood. And they were accountable to God on top of authority, because as I said in the last video, that whenever God gives somebody authority, like church leaders, like pastors or deacons, so on and so forth, there's accountability. And in James 3:1, you see that leaders of the church or teachers, it says, are held to a stricter judgment by God. In verse 2 through 7, it says, "Also bring with you your brethren of the tribe of Levi, the tribe of your father, that they may be joined with you and serve you while you and your sons are with you before the tabernacle of witness. They shall attend to your needs and all the needs of the tabernacle, but they shall not come near the articles of the sanctuary and the altar, lest they die, they and you also. They shall be joined with you and attend to the needs of the tabernacle of meeting, for all the work of the tabernacle, but an outsider shall not come near you. And you shall attend to the duties of the sanctuary and the duties of the altar, that there may be no more wrath on the children of Israel. Behold, I myself have taken your brethren, the Levites, from among the children of Israel. They are a gift to you, given by the Lord, to do the work of the tabernacle of meeting. Therefore you and your sons with you shall attend to your priesthood for everything at the altar and behind the veil, and you shall serve. And I give your priesthood to you as a gift for service, but the outsider who comes near shall be put to death." So only Aaron and his family could minister with the holy articles of the sanctuary of God. And the whole tribe of Levi had a special calling to be the side people of Aaron and the priests. And they were to help behind the scenes, and they were not allowed to do what the priests did. And in verses 18 through 20, says, big length of verses, "And the Lord spoke to Aaron, Here I myself have also given you charge of my heave offerings, all the holy gifts of the children of Israel, and I have given them as a portion to you and your sons, as an ordinance forever. This shall be yours of the most holy things reserved from the fire, every offering of theirs, every grain offering, and every sin offering, and every trespass offering, which they render to me, shall be most holy for you and your sons. In a most holy place you shall eat it, every male shall eat it, it shall be holy to you. This also is yours, the heave offering of their gift, with all the wave offerings of the children of Israel. I have given them to you and your sons and daughters with you, as an ordinance forever. Everyone who is clean in your house may eat it. All the best of the oil, and all the best of the new wine and the grain, their first fruits which they offered to the Lord, I have given them to you. Whatever first ripe fruit is in their land, which they bring to the Lord, shall be yours. Everyone who is clean in your house may eat it. Every devoted thing in Israel shall be yours. Everything that first opens the womb of all flesh, which they bring to the Lord, whether man or beast, shall be yours. Nevertheless, the firstborn of man you shall surely redeem, and the firstborn of unclean animals you shall redeem. And those redeemed of the devoted things you shall redeem when 1 month old, according to your valuation, for 5 shekels of silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, which is 20 gerahs. But the firstborn of a cow, the firstborn of a sheep, or the firstborn of a goat, you shall not redeem. They are holy. You shall sprinkle their blood on the altar and burn their fat as an offering made by fire for a sweet aroma to the Lord. And their flesh shall be yours, just as the wave breast and the right thigh are yours. All the heave offerings of the holy things, which the children of Israel offered to the Lord, I have given to you and your sons and daughters with you as an ordinance forever. It is a covenant of salt for forever before the Lord with you and your descendants with you. Then the Lord said to Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in their land, nor shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the children of Israel. So, as I mentioned, a lot of verses right here. But in these verses, in return for their service to the Lord, the priests were to receive a portion of the offerings which the people presented in worship, and they could keep all the parts of the sacrifices that were not consumed on the altar by fire. And also the offerings of the first fruits and everything devoted to the Lord was theirs as well. And salt doesn't burn, but was a metaphor in verse 19 to speak of the durability. And as salt keeps its flavor, so the Lord's covenant with the priesthood was durable. And the Lord would provide through the offerings of his people for the priests forever. And just a reminder from Exodus 29 verse 28, heave offerings were brought to God as part of the peace offering, and a Nazarite consecration offering in Numbers 6:20, and for Thanksgiving in Numbers 15 verse 19 through 21. And in the heave offering, a choice portion of the animal, the breast or the thigh, was heaved or waved before the Lord. And priests were deprived of inheritance of land, as God said he was the portion in their inheritance. And Psalm chapter 16 verse 5 says, the Lord is the portion of my inheritance and my cup. He maintains my lot. And that was the words of King David in Psalm 16 verse 5. And let's look at verse 21 through 24. It says, behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel as an inheritance in return for the work which they perform, the work of the tabernacle of meeting. Hereafter the children of Israel shall not come near the tabernacle of meeting, lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall perform the work of the tabernacle of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance. For the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer up as a heave offering to the Lord, I have given to the Levites as an inheritance. Therefore I have said to them, among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance. So verse 21 through 24, we see that the Levites received the tithes from the people. And this was their source of income and compensation for their service that they put in at the tabernacle. Kind of like how churches today collect offerings, and part of those offerings goes to the church leadership in their income and compensation. And the tithes belong to God, but God is the one that gives them to the Levites, and we see that in verse 21. And God received the tithe from the giver, and then God gave it to the Levite. And if they didn't give their tithe, they wouldn't be robbing the Levite, but they would be robbing God himself, as you can find in the very last book in Malachi chapter 3, verse 8 through 10, right before the Bible moves into the New Testament. And the tithes were also given by God as pay to the Levites who dedicated themselves to the service of the Lord, the people of God, and for the mission of God, or the things of God. And as we go into the book of Deuteronomy next, in chapter 14, verse 28-29, Every 3 years, the tithe was collected and distributed not only to the Levites, but also to those who were less fortunate or the more vulnerable, like the poor and the needy among Israel. And the Levites didn't have their best life now, as some prosperity gospel preachers today might proclaim. They did not have mansions, and they didn't have a perpetual inheritance as the other tribes did. And in verse 25 through 32, which wraps up the verses here, says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak thus to the Levites, and say to them, When you take from the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them as your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering of it to the Lord, 1/10 of the tithe. And your heave offering shall be reckoned to you as though it were a grain of the threshing floor, and as the fullness of the winepress. Thus you shall also offer a heave offering to the Lord from all your tithes which you receive from the children of Israel, and you shall give the Lord's heave offering from it to Aaron the priest. Of all your gifts you shall offer up every heave offering due to the Lord, and from all the best of them, the consecrated part of them. Therefore you shall say to them, When you have lifted up the best of it, then the rest shall be accounted to the Levites as the produce of the threshing floor, and as the produce of the winepress. You may eat it in any place, you and your households, for it is your reward for your work in the tabernacle of meeting. And you shall bear no sin because of it, when you have lifted up the best of it. But you shall not profane the holy gifts of the children of Israel, lest you die. So as the Levites themselves received the tithe, they were also required in these verses to present a tithe of what they received to the Lord, and then that would go directly to the priest. And what's interesting here is the priests, we never saw them commanded here to tithe from what they received, as they were considered holy and not to be used by others outside of the priestly families. And the Israelites had more obligation than just the tithe and given. And you see, they had the offerings of the first fruits back in verse 12 of all their produce, and then the firstborn offering in verse 15 of their flocks and their herds. And then these portions of each went to the priest and or the Levites. And the firstborn and the first fruits was risky given, as land couldn't yield much more produce, and the cow may not give birth again. Yet the first still belonged to God, and it was given to the priests. And God promised to bless this giving of the first fruit and the firstborn when it was done in faith. And Solomon said in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9 and 10, to honor the Lord with your possessions, with your first fruits of all your increase, so that your barns will be filled with plenty and vats will overflow with new wine. So Proverbs 3, verse 9 and 10, it does seem to give a prosperity message there. But as Christians, that should not be our main focus of our everyday life. In Israel, in Leviticus 19, verse 9 and 10, they gave a portion of their fields unharvested so that the poor could eat from these portions. And you might remember we went over that. And in Exodus 12, verse 37 through 40, a Passover sacrifice was required from every family every year. And then later in Nehemiah 10, verse 32 through 33, a temple tax was required. And in Numbers 32, verse 28 through 29 to come, there's a special tribute required. And the required giving of Israel was far more than 10% on top of these given requirements. They were also asked to give free will offerings, such as for the building of the tabernacle back in Exodus 35. So, in the wrap up, we're going to go over whether I believe that we are still to tithe today in the New Covenant or the New Testament church. And I'm going to give you my thoughts on the matter, and, dig for your own purposes. Some pastors love to preach on tithing and offerings and all that quite often, and then you have some that are afraid to talk about the tithing or offerings or anything to do with money because they're afraid it's going to turn people away. But when you go through the Bible chapter by chapter, you're going to see that you're going to talk about tithing. But to wrap up here, we see that the priests are accountable for the sanctuary and the priesthood, and God never gives authority without accountability. And we also see today that the Levites, they were God's chosen helpers for the priests in their ministry at the altar in the tabernacle. And likewise, let's go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 4 through 7. So 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 4 through 7. And the Apostle Paul writes, "There are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are differences in ministries, but the same Lord. And there are diversities of activities, but it is the same God who works all in all. But the manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all. For to one is given the word of wisdom through the Spirit, to another the word of knowledge through the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the same Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another different kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. But one and the same Spirit works all these things, distributing to each one individually as he wills." So in the New Testament here, we see that the church is talked as like a human body, where there's many different parts of this body, there's different parts with different callings and different gifts. And God is the God of order and organization, and that's the theme as we go through the book of Numbers. And we see the privileges of the priests and the Levites as the firstborn belong to the priests in devoted portions. And we see ultimately that God was their portion. And God is also our portion. God is also our inheritance, as you remember from Psalm 16, verse 5 with King David. God is our portion. He's our inheritance. He is our hope and our trust for our future, as we are built into the royal priesthood that you see in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. And we looked at the tithes from Israel that were given to the Levites, and then the Levites would also tithe, and that would be given to the priests. And the chapter shows us that the Lord restated the duties and support of both priests and Levites. And as I mentioned at the wrap-up here, that some see the tithe that went to support the Levites is covered by the government taxes today that we pay. And as the Levites were like government workers in ancient Israel, and they see the free will offerings or free will given mentioned in the Old Testament answers to what given is supposed to be emphasized in the New Testament. And personally, I am one that holds to that we are not under the tithe law. And in the New Testament, the New Covenant, in the church age, we are called for free will offerings. And nowhere specifically in the New Testament will you find the command to tithe. And it does speak of tithing in Luke 11, verse 42. I'll give you that one. But it speaks about doing it with the right heart. And then another passage that people like to look at and they'll argue for that we're under the tithe law today is Hebrews chapter 7, verse 5 through 9, and I challenge you to check that out. But yes, tithing is not a principle dependent on the Mosaic law, as Hebrews 7, verse 5 through 9 tells us. And you got that argument right. It explains tithing was practiced and honored by God before the law of Moses and the Abrahamic covenant. And let's talk about the principle of giving in the new covenant. So let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 1 through 4. So it says, 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1 through 4, Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me. So verse 2 in the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 16, he says, lay something aside to, for collection. So, he should have said, lay your tithes aside on the first day of the week if he was going to preach tithing in these verses. But what we see the Apostle Paul speaks of is given regularly, planned and proportional and privately. And 10%, which is a common, a tithe is 10%. 10% is a good starting place. And for some of you, 10% is not enough for you to give, as you are living way above comfort level. And for others, maybe they're living, dollar to dollar of income. So maybe 5% is a massive step of faith given current circumstances. And in Luke 16:11, it says, if you're untrustworthy about worldly wealth, who will trust you with the true riches in heaven? And given is a spiritual issue. It is not just a financial issue. And if you say, how little can I give and still be pleasing to God? It shows the condition of your heart. As Christians, we should want to give, the most that we can. We should want to give to help out different causes, to help out the less fortunate, to help out orphans and widows and, people that are just struggling in life. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, we'll look at verse 6 through 8. It says here, but this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you always, having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. So our giving, when we give, it should be generous and freely given and cheerful. And just like the Levites were supported through the tithes of Israel, church leaders should be supported by us as well in the church. And I want to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and look at verse 7. So as you can probably catch on to the pattern here, when you want to talk about offerings or, giving, both books of 1 Corinthians are excellent books to look at in the New Testament. So 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 7 says, whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock. Do I say these things as a mere man? Or does not the law say the same thing also? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about, or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be a partaker of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, it is a great thing if we reap your material things. If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But I used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me. So it would be better for me to die than anyone should make my boasting void. So Paul presents the same principle for ministers of the gospel, but they should do their work not for self-gain. They should not be living, their best life now with multiple aircrafts and multiple houses and mansions and, $500,000 cars and everything. Those who work for the kingdom of God, they should not be living for self-gain, but they should be willing to lay down themselves for the glory of God. And church leaders should not be living their best lives now when people below them are eating ramen noodles. Nor should a pastor live humbly in poverty when the church is able to provide better for the pastor. And church leaders should not live above God's people in mansions, the wealthy cars, fancy jewelry, whatever. And maybe you disagree with me on tithing, but even if you disagree with me, give more than 10% if you're able. But it should not be an issue this should not be an issue that divides us or that leads to an attack. And if you believe that tithing is for you, make sure your heart is right, and please continue to follow your convictions. No matter what I say or anybody else that you listen to on, things like tithing, if your convictions are different, go with your convictions. I'm just saying that there's no verse in the New Testament that commands the church to tithe. But that's going to wrap up this study, as next we'll look at the laws of purification on Thursday. So I hope you have a great rest of your night. And this is our midway point through the book of Numbers. So we'll be wrapping up here in about 5 weeks or so. 6 weeks, something like that. And I hope you have a great rest of your night. We'll see you Thursday night. God bless.